Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Inman, and I'm the Assistant Program Manager for the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Lodging Program. Thank you for joining the Kansas Food Code Update Forum. All participant microphones will be muted throughout the webinar, except when we hear from those who registered to comment verbally. Today's session will be recorded and will be posted online. If you didn't register to comment verbally today, but you would like to, please put that in the chat and we'll add you to the list, and hopefully we'll have time to hear from everyone who wants to speak today. We are going to limit verbal comments to 2 minutes so that as many people can speak as possible. But either way, if you have feedback or comments or suggestions or questions, please reach out to us using the web form, and we'll get that link put in the chat as we go throughout the presentation today. Now, there is a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. On today's agenda, we're going to cover why we have food safety requirements. Always start with the why. We're going to touch briefly on our compliance approach at KDA. Going to go into Food Code 101 briefly, and then the majority of the time will be spent reviewing the proposed updates to the Kansas Food Code. And then we'll have comments, verbal comments from participants, and finally review next steps. Of course, we have food safety requirements to prevent foodborne illness, and the Centers for Disease Control estimates that about 1 in 6 Americans will be expected to get a foodborne illness each year, and has a lot of bad outcomes with foodborne illness, and has even a cost to the economy. Of course, those numbers don't always mean much to us, so I think it's important to keep in mind the human beings that are behind those numbers. And here's one victim's story is shared by her family, Lauren Beth, who was a victim of the Jack in the Box outbreak in 1992 and 93. And her full story is shared there at stopfoodborneillness.org, and you can review that. A little more recently, another example of why we have food safety requirements is an outbreak of botulism at an event in Ohio. So of course, we at KDA don't think that our operators want to hurt anyone intentionally. So really the hard work is about finding the right level of food safety requirement without unduly burdening operators. And at KDA, we take a collaborative approach to that end. And our approach can be summarized as educate, warn, enforce. As we go through doing our inspections and enforcing the food code, we work with our operators to evaluate their systems and find those areas that can be improved that might increase risk. And as always, we encourage dialogue before, during, and after inspections. And as we're seeing here today, through the process of adopting updates to the Kansas Food Code regulations. So not everyone may be familiar with the food code and how it comes to exist nationally as well as in Kansas. So let's take a little bit of a Food Code 101 approach, and we'll talk about the FDA model food code, how that model food code is updated, how specific regulatory adoptions happen nationally, and then get into how Kansas food codes are updated. The Kansas Food Code is the name of the regulation for food establishments in Kansas, and food establishments are food businesses that provide food directly to the end consumer. So to understand how the Kansas Food Code is written, we're going to start at the national level. The United States Food and Drug Administration publishes a model food code every 4 years, and the in-between 2 years, the intermediate 2 years, they publish a supplement, and that's a continuing evolutionary process to update the food code. 2017 is the most recent full version of the food code, the model food code that's out there, and that there's a 2017 supplement that was issued in 2019. So the food code at the national level has been evolutionarily updated. It's just evolved. There's not been any radical changes, just tweaks here and there. And the current version is no exception. Now you might ask what changes are made in each version. Many of the changes are the result of new science in food safety that shows a new food safety control is needed, or that an existing control can be relaxed. These issues are brought before the Conference for Food Protection to be considered by various stakeholders every 2 years. Changes that are accepted by the Conference of Food Protection are forwarded to the Food and Drug Administration for their consideration whether to be included into the model food code in the next version. So there's broad stakeholder input into the national model food code. Now, at each regulatory level, at each jurisdiction, they can adopt their own version of a food code in whole or in part. And as you'll see in this map, across the country, we're not alone. In Kansas, we have one food safety agency responsible for regulating food establishments like grocery stores, restaurants, school meal service, convenience stores, and so forth. And if you look at those versions of the food code that I mentioned, this map shows the last snapshot that was taken of which versions various jurisdictions have. And you can see that there are many states surrounding us that have newer versions of the food code that are based on updated versions. And those newer versions, those jurisdictions cover approximately 60% of the population of the United States. Now that we've reviewed how changes are made to the model food code, let's look at the process we're undertaking in Kansas to adopt the next Kansas food code. As you saw, the current Kansas food code is based primarily on the 2009 FDA model food code. Although there were quite a few changes to cover today, they represent a small fraction of the total regulation. As you can see here, I want to point out that we're in the informal stakeholder feedback part of our process. So we're still in that part of the process where we have a lot more ability to accept feedback and make any changes that might be needed to be made. Once we get into that formal adoption process, there's just a lot less flexibility. It's a lot of steps, as you can see there. And so we really want to make sure that we have this food code in the best place possible before we go to that formal adoption process. And getting your feedback is critical to achieving that goal. So now that we've covered the background information, let's get into the specific changes. We'll generally go through the changes as they are ordered in the food code, but first I have a couple of notes to point out. If you'll see as we go through each of these changes has either a year in parentheses or occasionally you'll see a KS, and that tells that either the year or the version of the model food code that contained that change when it was first proposed, or in the case of the KS in parentheses, those are changes that we've proposed in Kansas to make them fit Kansas a little bit better. I'm not going to go into typically any relettering, so where a new provision may be added that would change the order. I'm not getting into all that renumbering of the ABCs. So just be aware that there may be some current F might get moved down to the new G under the proposed updates. So keep that in mind. One change that I want to point out that this is throughout the entire food code is we are proposing to replace the current term, which is potentially hazardous food, time temperature control for safety food, with just time temperature control for safety food, or TCS for short. So you may have heard of PHF, and now we're going to shift fully to TCS, which more accurately reflects the controls that are used with these types of foods. So time and temperature controls are used to keep these foods safe. Now, if you don't have them pulled up, the links have been sent there for the actual draft code as well as a summary of changes document. If you haven't pulled that down recently, if you pulled it down last week, we did find a couple of other updates that we had to make, so you might want to pull down a more current copy, but the latest version will be available on our website. So let's jump right into some more changes. Chapter 1 in the definition section, and I will go ahead and turn my video off just so you can focus on the changes. Terms defined in Kansas laws, we'll use those definitions. So those that may be in the model food code have been replaced with the statutory definitions. So for an example, food is defined in Kansas statutes annotated 65-656C. So that replaces the model food code definition of food. So that'll be throughout the definitions section. And I didn't call those out specifically. And that reflects where we, with our current version as well. A technical change, there was a definition of enterohemorrhagic E. coli that was deleted and moved as an example of a type of Shiga toxin producing E. coli, or STEC. The term intact meat has been added as a definition, and that includes vacuum tumbled meats. That is reflects typically those products have a cooking temperature impact when we see that term intact meat. Definition of mechanically tenderized is updated to align better with the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service term mechanically tenderized. We're proposing to add a Kansas-specific definition of product assessment, and this is a type of scientific study that can be undertaken on a specific food product to see if that product does require time and temperature control for safety or not. Moving into Chapter 2, throughout the chapter, references related to Salmonella typhi and non-typhoidal Salmonella have been updated throughout the proposed draft. And those reflect updates in terminology nationally. A new requirement or a new paragraph is proposed to be added that would remove a requirement for a designated person in charge for certain low-risk operations. Proposing a new section that would require a person in charge to be designated and have a certified food protection manager certificate. And there are currently 6 American National Standards Institute accredited certificate programs. And just to give a little bit more context on this issue, the National Restaurant Association reports that they've issued over 11,000 ServSafe certificates in Kansas from 2016 to earlier this year, 2021. So there's a large number of folks that are certified in the state. Those certificates do need to be renewed once every 5 years. And some might ask what the benefit of food manager certification might be. And there have been studies done nationally that show restaurants or establishments that have certified food protection managers are less likely to have foodborne illness outbreaks, have better food safety practices, and have better compliance rates with food safety requirements. Under the duties of the person in charge, we're proposing to add a new requirement to ensure that employees check and handle food deliveries properly if those deliveries occur outside of normal operating hours. So that's a trend that's developed where operations will get deliveries outside of being staffed. And so I wanted to have a specific requirement to check those as soon as they're on the clock at that time. A new requirement to ensure that employees are routinely monitoring food temperatures during hot and cold holding. Modify the current requirement about employees being notified of their responsibility to report certain illnesses or diagnoses or conditions to add a requirement that it's verifiably notified of that requirement. So basically signing off on that they were notified that the employee is required to report. And finally, under this duties of the person in charge, to add a new P to paragraph P to ensure the development and implementation of any required procedures. So those all become additional responsibilities of the person in charge under the proposed update. Under reporting symptoms and diagnosis, we're proposing to amend those to add non-typhoidal Salmonella, or NTS, as one of the reportable illnesses for action by the person in charge. Adding a provision to require exclusion or restriction as applicable of food employees who have non-typhoidal salmonella. Of course, if we add exclusion or restriction, then we need to have requirements added to remove those exclusions or restrictions for those employees. Proposing to add a new section regarding the use of bandages, finger cots, or finger stalls. So there's a couple of pictures. Those terms aren't always that familiar, but if those are being used to cover a bandage or a wound of some kind, if you're using a finger cot or a finger stall over a bandage or for some other reason, then you need to wear a clean single service use glove over the bandage, finger cot, or finger stall if the employee is working with exposed food. Proposing to add a new requirement for written procedures for the cleanup of vomiting and diarrheal events. This is related to controlling norovirus, which is the leading cause of foodborne illness in the United States. And put in the chat an example template plan for download. You can develop your own plans, and we plan to develop an updated template ourselves for posting, as this is, we believe, a good idea anyway, but as a requirement, then having that plan in writing, be able to refer to that and implement it appropriately to help reduce the spread of norovirus. Moving into chapter 3, regarding preventing contamination from from the hands of the food employees, proposing amending paragraph B to add cross-reference to D into a new section E. So adding those cross-references to D and E, and the new D will make the current D E. So that's where those two new cross-references come into. The new D will be another exception to allow bare hand contact with ready-to-eat food if those ingredients in the dish are going to be cooked. And then the current D will move to E, and that is relating to a double hand washing provision with associated record keeping to allow bare hand contact in certain limited situations. Under 3.302.11, adding a new subparagraph to require separating raw animal foods, such as raw beef or raw poultry, from fruits and vegetables before or after they are washed. Moving into cooking requirements, these proposing to update to the current science, which would add the term intact meat, revise cooking for ground meats from 15 seconds up to 17 seconds at 155 degrees. 158 degrees would still be an instantaneous kill, or complete cooking at instantaneously at 158 degrees. Proposing to amend the subparagraph A3 regarding poultry and other similar products to from 15 seconds down to an instantaneous cook. And then amending the order to regarding cooking of meat roasts so that the time and temperature requirements would be placed first, followed by the oven temperatures that are required. The current requirement for plant food cooking requirements changes the term from fruits and vegetables to plant foods, and that reflects that not all edible parts of plants are fruits or vegetables. So this will cover all the bases with those food products. Under thawing, changing those to redesignate them from a core violation or a core item to a priority validation violation. So in our three-tiered system of priority being the most important, the most directly related to preventing foodborne illness, and priority foundation being those elements that support preventing foodborne illness, this would go into that middle tier of items. Also proposing to add a new requirement for reduced oxygen packaged frozen fish to be removed from the ROP either before thawing under refrigeration or immediately before, either before or immediately after thawing using the other allowed procedures. For date marking, proposing to add a new exemption from date marking requirements for live in-shell molluscan shellfish. Their shelf life is so short that the 7 days allowed under the date marking requirements are really not applicable. So they would be exempted from date marking requirements. And then amend another exemption from date marking to clarify that those dry fermented shelf stable sausages, they are still exempt if they're in the original casing or if the original casing is removed. Regarding how the disposition of food items relating to date marking requirements, there was a kind of a typographical error in the model food code where it said if the item was appropriately date marked to exceed the 7 days, then that was a problem. We're changing that just to make it reflect better language, better grammar, that it was inappropriately marked to exceed 7 days. So a food item that was marked, but was marked to hold for too long. Under time as public health control, adding new subparagraphs that would add the procedures that would allow a food that becomes the time temperature control for safety food, either when it's cut or opened, to be held using time as a public health control if it starts at 70 degrees or less at the time that it's cut or the can is opened, that it stays at 70 degrees or less, and that it's served or discarded within 4 hours. So an example of this might be cutting melons. You have the melon at 70 degrees or less when it's cut. You could use time as a public health control with that item. Or if you opened a can of corn, put that out on a salad bar, you could hold that for up to 4 hours and it wouldn't have to start at 41 degrees or less. Under specialized processing methods, the specific variance requirements that are listed there, we're proposing an amendment to clarify that only time temperature control for safety foods that are prepared using reduced oxygen packaging methods that do not have secondary barriers in place require a variance. So just a little clarification on the specific products that require a variance in those cases. Continuing on the reduced oxygen packaging part of the food code, proposing that this, what we call the second barrier, food items that are maybe vacuum packaged or otherwise reduced oxygen packaged, that they're extending that reduced oxygen packaging shelf life of those products from 14 days to 30 days if they meet the requirements that are listed in that portion of the food code. Also proposing to require notification and providing the required hazard analysis critical control point or HACCP plan to be provided to KDA prior to implementing that plan under those second barrier ROP foods. Proposing under reduced oxygen packaging of fish, there's an increased risk of botulism with fish, and we're proposing, based on the 2017 model food code, to add a requirement that fish that is reduced oxygen packaged at the retail location, such as a grocery store or restaurant, be labeled that it's to be kept frozen until the time of use. Under the reduced oxygen packaging methods that are known as cook, chill, or sous vide, two different types of methods there that are highly related, proposing to amend those requirements to allow holding at 41 degrees for 7 days. Currently, you'd have to cool to 34 degrees first, and you could only hold it for 72 hours at 41 degrees. So proposing to update that, a less restrictive requirement there. And in the same process, cook, chill, or sous vide, to allow those products in a sealed package to be cooled. So held there, they moved to 41 degrees and held for 7 days at 41. A total time from day of preparation of 30 days maximum. So again, this is expanding the allowance for these products while maintaining safety and preventing botulism formation. We also currently will have a procedure that allows this. This would codify the procedure, put it right in the food code, adding that if you're using a reduced oxygen packaging method, but you have a procedure to make sure that none of those products stay around for more than 48 hours, that you don't have to do a full HACCP plan. Moving into food label requirements, a little bit of a Kansas twist on this one. We're proposing to allow that foods repackaged or packaged in food establishments be allowed to have information, labeling information available in booklets or pamphlets or similar written form upon request of the consumer, rather than having those requirements on the food packages themselves. Proposing to update another requirement to account for labeling exemptions that are found in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And then a grammatical update to provide clarity that some specific types of foods are examples and not a complete list when there's an alternative method of labeling that's available. Moving into chapter 4, proposing to update a requirement to be more accurate. The current requirement says that if an item is certified for conformance by ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, and it's technically the ANSI creates standards, an American National Standard, and so the item would need to be certified for conformance to the actual standard rather than the accrediting agency. Proposing to add a new section that would require equipment and utensil cleaning agents and sanitizers to be provided and readily accessible for use. So they're required to be used, and this would just explicitly state that they would also need to be available for use. Proposing a slight addition to 4502.13 to say that single service and single use articles must not be used if they may have become contaminated. So this should just be an explicit requirement that says if they are stored inappropriately and may have become contaminated, they cannot be used. In chapter 5, proposing to update the code to clarify that automatic hand washing facilities are included in the definition of a hand washing sink, and therefore do not need to have an additional requirement of a second hand sink. Proposing to update the plumbing requirements that prohibit certain direct drain connections in equipment fixtures, adopting a previous model food code revision that had not been adopted in Kansas before, and then modifying that requirement to allow warewashing sinks that have a direct drain connection if they have certain safety conditions met. So they have a properly trapped floor drain within 5 feet downstream of the fixture. And so this would align better with model plumbing codes that are adopted at various localities within Kansas. And I think that that would be beneficial to the industry while providing the necessary safety margins. Proposing an amendment to clarify that conveying sewage properly is intended to prevent an imminent health hazard, that needs to be conveyed in a way that it doesn't create an imminent health hazard. In Chapter 6, we're proposing to add a new paragraph that would allow dogs in exterior areas of food establishment premises without a variance if certain requirements are met. Currently, we are accepting variance requests from operators who want to allow dogs on the patio or other exterior premises of the food establishment. We have provided a template and we've been approving those variance requests if they meet those requirements. And those were created based on review of several other jurisdictions' requirements. And just so you can see those, this change would allow operators to just comply with these requirements, but not have to go through the steps of requesting a variance and getting an approval from KDA for that. I think these are basic. The dogs are under control. They're not allowed to contaminate reusable food contact surfaces. They're kept in proper areas, and there are plans and procedures in place to address the dog waste. And that food employees are trained to wash their hands after any contact with the animals before handling food or clean equipment or clean utensils. In Chapter 7, we're proposing a Kansas change to consolidate two identical requirements where the only distinction was whether the items were held for use in the establishment or held for retail sale, and combining those into one requirement. Don't feel that there's a benefit to that division that outweighs the challenges that it may present. So this would just all be accounted for use, or for retail sale would all be held under one requirement that they're held appropriately. This will be your cleaning supplies, pesticides, motor oil, all those kinds of things that you might see in a food establishment or a grocery store or a mixed use store. Another Kansas specific change that we're proposing would be to amend the subparagraph to reflect that pesticide use precautions need to be applied to all pesticides that may be used in food establishments, not just restricted use pesticides, which there really aren't very many that are used of these specific RUPs. This is laid out in the federal and Kansas pesticide laws as a very specific subset of chemicals, and the requirements apply to all pesticides, not just restricted use pesticides. Another change we think would be practical is to specifically prohibit that food contact items such as utensils or single service items may not be stored in a container that was previously used to store poisonous or hold poisonous or toxic materials. So the transmission fluid bucket shouldn't be used to hold the plastic knives, as an example. Next change would be regarding chemicals for washing or treating or storing fruits and vegetables. So a little bit of a rearrangement on the specific ordering to make a lead-in paragraph, and then changing the paragraphs about those antimicrobial agents to make sure that they meet federal regulations that are adopted in Kansas already. To make sure that those chemicals are appropriate for those uses. Proposing to update the food code to harmonize with pesticide laws about when rodent bait is required to be placed in tamper-resistant bait stations. The model food code and the current Kansas food code requires that all rodent bait is placed in tamper-resistant bait stations, but that doesn't line up with the industry standard in the federal and state pesticide laws. And so we would remove that requirement and just say when it's required on the label to be in situations when required on the label to be in a tamper-resistant bait station, that would be the time that it would need to be, not just generally because it's in a food establishment. In Chapter 8, kind of a reordering of these hazard analysis critical control point plans. And this is only for the plans that are required if you're doing a specialized process such as reduced oxygen packaging, or under a variance, it requires a supporting HACCP plan. Then we request some general information to be submitted along with the plan and just reordering the various elements. And then another change to clarify that any food employee or person in charge may perform monitoring activities or take corrective actions. So as it's currently worded, it could be read to think that only food employees could take those actions and the person in charge could not. Under ceasing operations and reporting for imminent health hazards, proposing to add paragraph to allow food operations to continue operations during extended water or electrical outages if they've received if they have written operational plans to operate safely under those conditions, and those plans have been approved by KDA. So that is the list of the changes that we're proposing. And then we'll move into the verbal comment portion. Again, if you want to submit written comments, we have the web form that you can use for that. We definitely want to hear thoughts on any of these changes. But now we'll move into folks who have requested to share verbally. And so first on the list, I have Tina Haremza. Don't know if Tina has been able to join us today. If you are, you could unmute yourself. Okay, I'm not hearing from Tina at this point, so maybe she has joined us later or having some issues. We'll come back to her. Hamid Rafiq is the next person. Okay. Okay, next on the list I have Naren Rathod. Is Naren on the line with us today? If you're having trouble with the mute or anything, please let us know in the chat. We'll try to work that out. Okay, next on the list is Nick Reinecker.
Can you hear me okay?
Sure can, Nick. We'll start your 2 minutes. Appreciate you commenting.
Thank you, sir. One quick thing on the 2-10212 involving the person in charge being certified. How does that, how does the payment, is there a charge for the business? I would not like to have to pay for that if possible. Is there a time that there could be a grandfather clause in that with people who've had a business for over a certain amount of years? Or then also what is required, like, are you requiring somebody on each shift to be in that certified aspect, or how really does that exactly work? And then I was kind of unclear when you were talking about the plants and edible parts of plants, exactly what those changes were going to come up with. And then I didn't know if there would be time later or what, if I had a general question about the food code that was referenced from my own inspector to bring up here at this forum. But my main reason for doing public comment is to say that I'm not really sure I like the addition of the 10212. And then if it is going to be done, the specifics behind it, and then also the, I guess, fiscal note attached to it. Want to maintain, that without being. So I guess that will take care of my public comment, and I thank you for allowing me to speak, sir.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your participation. And we'll circle back with you on the, we'll get back to you on the other questions that you had, because we definitely want to explore those outside of this venue. So appreciate that. Well, that has reached the extent of the folks who pre-registered for verbal comments. If at this point, again, if you have any other comments that you don't want to share verbally, please use the web form to submit those, and we'll take those. But if you would like to comment verbally, I think we have some time today. And if you want to type your name into the chat, and we will get to those. Yeah, the format today is not necessarily to answer questions, it's to really get the feedback. So appreciate Nick you sharing with those, and we want to get your questions answered separately. We're also probably going to be compiling a frequently asked questions document based on questions that come in, so that we can answer those, because if someone has it, I'm sure many people might have those questions. Well, while you're thinking about it, we still have a little bit of time. You can still put that in the chat if you would like to speak today, but I'll go ahead and tell you that our next steps, again, if you would provide any additional comments or feedback using that web form that's on our website, and you can get to that pretty easily. And we're going to compile those and consider those. We're also going to answer any questions. We can answer you directly. And again, we'll be compiling those into a frequently asked questions format, as questions seem to be more prevalent. And then our plan is to begin the formal adoption process around August 1st. And then that's going to be a whole, as was on the earlier slide, there are quite a few steps with that part of the process. So planning on that around August 1st. I'll put up our contact information. Also, if you ever just want to contact us for any concerns, you can definitely do that. For not seeing anybody else for written comment or verbal comments at this point, but Nick, yeah, with the person in charge, we definitely have taken that into consideration, and we're trying to calculate the cost as part of the required economic impact statement. So that'll be available as soon as we can get that out there. It'll be put into the same website as the comment form, so you can consider that. And we've definitely taken notes on that.
Well, will there be option for further public comment? This came up kind of on my radar a little late, so I didn't have enough time to prepare on the formal side of it. Will there be another opportunity for public comment, or do we just go, if we have anything else to say, written through the website? Thank you.
Yeah, written would be great. That way we can really consider it. This is, again, the informal side where we have a lot more ability to consider those things. Once we really want to have it in a good place before we put it into the formal comments. And I think you've hit on that. Certified Food Protection Manager requirement is one that probably has the most cost. There's some exceptions for certain low risk types of operations, and a couple that we've identified that would probably be accepted from that or not required to have it would be senior satellite meal sites, and then school meal programs that have school meal programs have a separate training program that's we feel is analogous and meets the same intent of that requirement. With any of the requirements under the Kansas Food Code, we have, as I mentioned, the educate, warn, enforce as the approach. So the Certified Food Protection Manager would be one element that would be considered in the whole of the operation in any specific case as to if any enforcement action would be warranted in that specific case. So that's a good point, and we're definitely taking feedback on that. So written feedback will definitely be considered. Okay, and I'm not seeing anyone else yet that's asked to speak verbally. So with that, I appreciate your time today and your participation. Again, please give us any feedback that you think of. Use that written form and we will definitely consider it. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great day.